So, Dracula. You've probably heard the name before, right? I mean, we all know him, but we all love him. Maybe not love. I mean, I've never met the guy personally, but Dracula is like my Roman Empire. Like, I love vampires. I think vampires, they're cool, they're fun. I love to talk about them and write about them, and that's why I'm writing like a whole vampire novel series currently. I mean, I'm gonna start with one. But if there is one Dracula, if there is one vampire that I just can't get out of my brain, it's Dracula, because that is where my whole love of vampires started in the first place. About half a year ago, I figured, why not watch every Dracula? I mean, I've already seen, like, plenty of them. You know, you got the 1931 version, you got Nosferatu, you've got 1979 version, the 1958 version, the 1992 version. I've seen a lot of them. Boy, was I wrong. I have not, or had not, until recently, seen a lot of Draculas. As many, or at least not as many as I thought, because there are so many. Like, there are so many Draculas, guys. There are so many Draculas. I think Count Dracula is the fictional character with the most on-screen appearances out of any fictional character aside from like Sherlock Holmes. There are hundreds. Like IMDb, maybe not the most accurate list that I've seen because there are definitely ones on there that don't actually have Dracula in them. But it lists like 150 Dracula movies. And I was like, "Oh, getting in way over my head." So I decided to limit myself to some criteria here. Like, first of all, number one has to be either adaptations or sequels to adaptations. And number two, if it's a sequel, it has to have the character of Count Dracula in it. So, according to these ground rules, which are arbitrary, and you might quibble with me over whether or not some of these movies on this list should count, but it's my list. I get to do what I want. So that means that there's, unfortunately, because some of these are great, there's going to be no Dracula's daughter, son of Dracula, or no Countess Dracula. That doesn't even have anything to do with Dracula. That's Erzsébet Bathory, okay? Nothing to do with Dracula. Stop calling her that, guys. What was I saying? Oh, right. No Countess Dracula, no Dracula's daughter, no Brides of Dracula, and no Dracula Untold. So I'm like limiting myself here. I've managed to narrow the list down to 45 films. And there were going to be like at least one or two more, but I could not find them. So these are all the adaptations and sequels that I was able to find readily available to watch. Which is still quite a long list, which is why we're only doing half today. It's going to take us up all the way through the end of the 1970s. Hi, editing Leanne here, just popping in to let you all know that this is definitely not going to be only two videos. I ended up being much more long-winded with a lot of these mini reviews of these films than I had meant to, so we are only going to cover a few of these films today. I'm only going to be going up until the early 1950s, not the end of the 1970s. That will be hopefully the end of the next video. We'll cover the rest of this first half. So thank you. And boy, some of these movies are definitely some of the movies of all time. Mm. Number one, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, 1922. Ooh, we're starting off strong here with F.W. Murnau's A Legally Actionable Classic. Technically, there was another lost Hungarian Dracula film from 1921, Dracula Halala. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Um, But although that one would not have made my list anyways, even if it was not a lost film, because it was not really an adaptation at all. It barely has anything to do with Dracula. It's Dracula in name only, whereas Nosferatu is Dracula in all but name. And this was almost lost media as well. I'm I'm not saying I am an advocate for like plagiarism or copyright infringement, and I definitely think that Murnau could have gone about things in a different way. Like he did try to get the rights to the novel, to adapt the novel. He was denied by Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, and he didn't. I guess he just didn't want to like try harder, or make his own 100% unique vampire film. So he was just like, like if I change the names and some plot details, like no one's gonna notice, right? Yeah, people noticed, and by people I mean Florence Stoker, and when this almost became lost media because all of the prints were to be destroyed, and we're actually quite lucky, very, very lucky that at least one, was preserved. Because this is a gorgeous film, okay? This is, copyright infringement, sure, but I feel like that's not, usually you should not use the word but in that case, but also, it's like a masterpiece. I oh God, there's like I don't want to like start off by saying like, oh my God, film number one is a masterpiece, but it kind of is. There's gonna be like a lot of films on this list where there are some high highs, but also like the lows are so low. Nosferatu is just, it's not perfect, okay? I just want to get that, right off the bat. It's not a perfect film. I don't want anyone to get on my case about that. I know film buffs love it. Not, I mean, not everyone, but a lot of people do, and it's like it's gorgeous. It has its flaws though. I Some of these like are just kind of quibbles, that I have with like silent films overall. Like it's a limited medium. There's only so much they can do in an early 1920s silent film. Like there's technical limitations, but I don't hold that against it. Like you can tell that everything was shot day for night, especially if you watch the colorized version. I would not necessarily recommend going for the colorized version if you're going to watch this. Just go for the black and white one because it's much less obvious that everything was shot day for night because for whatever reason they always tint the sky blue. So it kind of like I think takes away a bit from the ending where he burns up in the sun when it always looks like he's out in the sun. But the acting is great. I feel like silent films can have quite a reputation for like really overly exaggerated pantomime style acting, and that's for a reason. It's like when you don't actually have dialogue being spoken out loud, you do need to like actors do need to like find alternative ways to express their emotions because you can't just be constantly having intertitles interrupting the film for the dialogue. But I think there is a lot of like very naturalistic film, and it is like melodramatic, but the melodrama works. It works with the setting, it works with the story. It's very gothic. It's gorgeously, perfectly gothic. And it's like there's this perfect pathos and this tragedy to the film. It's interesting what they do with the role of women or the one woman in it, which is Ellen. She's kind of like an amalgamation of both Mina and Lucy in a way. Like female portrayals in Dracula movies are not great. I'm going to have a lot to say on that later. Um, but like in this one, I think in this one and the multiple other iterations of Nosferatu in the future is that they are some of the few ones to give the female lead like actual agency, but it's just kind of a shame that in that with that agency, it's always like through her death. It's like she has the agency and the ability to be the one who saves the day and stops Count Orlok from wreaking havoc and destroying the town with plague, but she has to sacrifice herself to do it. Um, which I think it kind of gives her back a little bit of agency that like Mina and Lucy lack in other adaptations that they did, or at least Mina did have in the book. Um, I just like it is very interesting. I think I'll get more deeply into this later as I talk about what other directors in the future will be doing with Nosferatu. But I understand here that like Murnau, he was definitely kind of working with his own limitations because he was trying to meld his own unique ideas with this framework of the Dracula the novel and make it into its own unique thing. And I think he does make it into his own unique thing. Like Nosferatu is much more than just a rip-off of Dracula. I mean, in a way it is a rip-off of Dracula, but I think it is kind of interesting. It's almost like a work of fan fiction, you could say. Um, like in how it uses like this creative um, synthesis of ideas between the type of vampire that is presented in Stoker's novel, Count Dracula, that he came up with um, original ideas, but also tying those back into older folklore about vampires. Like the plague carrying aspect is quite unique to Nosferatu, but it's not unique to folklore. Like in like European myths about the undead, like that was a very common theme, that they were carriers of disease and plague and death. And it's very interesting to me that in this one and in none of the other Nosferatus to come, that turning other people, okay, not all of them, not all of them, but in this one at least to start with, turning other people into vampires is never brought up at all. Like that was a very big thing in the novel. Anyone who's bitten by a vampire and is killed by one becomes one. There's like other aspects of the novel, like I said, that kind of put that into dispute, but that was kind of a plague in that aspect in the book, like the plague of vampirism itself, like anyone who dies, as a result of one becomes one themselves, and then they propagate this evil by turning more people into more vampires. Whereas it is made more literal in the movie in Nosferatu. And I think it's like even spookier in a way because it is like very much set in a time like before germ theory. And that's kind of like a lot of the reason why vampires and demons and the undead and such were so tied to disease because people just didn't know how disease spread. They had like miasma theory, or it could be, like you're being haunted by like the evil, hungry, ravenous spirit of your dead husband, and he's like literally sucking the life out of you. And then once that happens, you're gonna die, and then you're gonna become this like angry, life devouring vampire yourself, and it's just going to continue to spread throughout the town. And, I think there is definitely themes of like fear of the other in this. Like, this is not perhaps the place and the time to get into it here. Other people have brought up, like anti-Semitic undertones. Like it's kind of this implication in like the association with rats and vermin and the way that um, Count Orlok is styled. It's like he was like very rat-like and has this like hooked nose that he kind of looks like very ugly anti-Semitic stereotypes of the time, and I think that's wrong. That's a valid interpretation. But also, I do want to give Murnau the benefit of the doubt here, based on, some research I've done on this. What other people have said is that I doubt that he was consciously being anti-Semitic at the time. I think it was kind of this unconscious inclusion of, like the fears of the German people of the time and, kind of this fear of disease and of rats and what that sort of symbolized for people. And I think it's just kind of, important to bring that up though, because, even today, perhaps especially today, it's good to keep in mind where like unconscious biases and symbolism that might have meanings other than what we intend can like creep into our creative works, our movies and books and other media. Um, so I think that is a valid interpretation of that, but yeah, the fear of the other is also something that is very present on and much more explicitly so, I would say, in the novel. Like Bram Stoker, he had his prejudices. There is some actual, like, unfortunately, quite overt anti-Semitism in the book. There are definitely more interpretations I could get into here, but I'm trying not to ramble too long for this movie. I didn't actually like write anything down for this one specifically, so I didn't constrain myself on this film as much as I probably should have. Because there's definitely points that I'm missing. Like there are downsides, there are pitfalls, ways that this movie, kind of falters. Like I do think the character of Canuck, I did think it was pronounced knock, like knock on wood, knock on the door like it is in English, but apparently the recent Nosferatu remake is pronounced Canuck. Clearly, I don't speak German. Um, like I think he is kind of an interesting hybrid character between Renfield and um, Jonathan Harker's boss, which, and I think it's kind of almost like a reverse Renfield situation where Renfield in the book, we only ever see him, um, like after he's already in the asylum, and he has this extremely vague connection with Dracula. We don't know how it started, and we don't know how it starts with Canuck in this film either, but he has this sort of like occult connection with Count Orlok, and he is very consciously helping to bring him over to Duisburg, to Germany from Transylvania, to carry out like a vague, nefarious plan to further spread pestilence throughout the land. And we don't really know like how he got involved, how he like what is in this for him, but I think it's like definitely very subtle filmmaking here with like the use of like occult symbols. I feel like this movie kind of rewards you for paying attention, but at the same time, it kind of doesn't because I think it throws things in there that it doesn't really have the time to follow up on. Like there's a Van Helsing analog character who is barely in the movie at all, and he kind of barely affects the movie at all. He's just kind of in there randomly because, well, we need a Van Helsing character. How should I rate Nosferatu? Like someone is ultimately going to be mad at me if I don't give it an S tier. It's very good. I don't think there's going to be that many S tiers on this list, or that many A tiers either, probably. But, like, it has its flaws. It has things that I think it could have done better, but it's still really good. I think it's worth an A. It's an A, it's a strong A. It's an A plus. It's an A plus. How about that? Number two, Dracula, 1931. Ah, yes, the universal classic that started it all. The one that gave us the quintessential imagery that we now associate with Dracula. The cape, the hypnotic eyes, the heavy Hungarian accent. You do have to give this movie credit for being the first horror talkie and essentially spawning an entire film genre. Bela Lugosi, he deserves all the kudos for delivering an absolutely magnetic performance. Like, he just is Dracula for like so many people for a good reason because he's amazing. But like, I gotta be honest here. I mean, for as good as he is, and for as great as Dwight Fry is as Renfield, the rest of the movie is kind of meh. Like, I know it's a classic, and I know a lot of people love it, but like, it's just kind of dull in a lot of places, and the only thing that really saves it from being so boring are, the performances of Dwight Fry and Bela Lugosi, and, I guess Edward Van Sloan is pretty good too as Van Helsing. And also, it's not that long. It's only like barely an hour and 10 minutes long. Any longer than that, and it would have been so dry, I think. Um, so it like they give really good over the top performances, but like the rest of the actors, they're just kind of cardboard cutouts for the most part. I'm sorry. I don't want to be mean, but like they're just kind of like the other characters in this kind of feel like they're overshadowed by the big personalities to the point that they're basically just extra bits of scenery for like the big personalities to chew on
Look. I threw it on the ground. You must think I'm a joke.
in this. If the lack of dynamic action and dynamic camera work and the fact that most of the movie centers around people sitting in rooms and talking kind of makes it feel like a play, that's because it is. It's basically just a filmed version of the stage play adaptation of Dracula from the 1920s. And I'm not saying, that's a bad thing inherently, like plays aren't bad and inherently boring. I'm kind of like a mild theater nerd myself, and I've seen a pretty great production of Dracula on stage actually, but I feel like in the medium of film there's just so much more they could have done. It's like there's so much more that they could have done to open up and expand the world and the action as it played out on screen, and they just didn't, with like the exception of the fantastic castle set. Like that is a castle. Like that is a great castle. I love that castle. But then everything else is just kind of like a room with people sitting on couches. And like there's so much more you can do with Dracula than people sitting and talking on couches. It also doesn't really help that there's no soundtrack, which is kind of makes it a bit of an awkward experience at times for a modern audience. Like, not every single movie needs a soundtrack, but most of them these days have one, and you never really notice just how much it enhances the experience of a film until you watch a movie without one, especially one in which most of the acting is like so milquetoast that they're really not selling the emotions very well on their own, with the exception of like two or three of the actors out of the cast. Which is why it's a good thing that there now is a version of the movie with a score written by Philip Glass about 20 years ago. They got the Dracula Complete Legacy DVD collection from Universal. They have that version of the movie that you can watch with the Philip Glass score on there. And I think it does genuinely enhance the movie. It makes for a better viewing experience, although there are a few points where you can tell it's a bit more of a modern soundtrack than one that would have been from the 1930s, and a few places where like it seems like it's a bit the music is a bit incongruous with what is going on, like the kind of dramatic beats that are happening on screen. Like a modern viewer like myself, I don't think that the attempts of humor always land. Like especially I don't know why they felt the need to add in this like Cockney comic relief orderly character at the mental asylum that just bullies Renfield and exposits from the newspaper all the time. Like, haha, just isn't it so funny? Like 20th century early 20th century medical abuses and bullying of mentally ill people. That's just so funny, right?
He's crazy.
They're all crazy. They're all crazy except you and me. Sometimes I have me doubts about you.
I guess I gotta give this movie a C. I know that seems low, and you can argue and yell at me in the comments about how I'm objectively wrong because this is a classic film and how dare I give it such a low score. And it's like I want to rate it higher, like basically just like based on the strengths of Lugosi's and Fry's performances, but I don't think the rest of the movie is quite worth it. Number three, Dracula, the Spanish one, 1931. A bit of context for anyone who doesn't know. Back in the early days of talking pictures, movie studios would occasionally film one or more versions of a big movie in another language, particularly Spanish, for foreign markets. Shot on the same sets and using the same but translated script, but with an entirely different cast and crew. So that is what this movie is in relation to the previous one. Interestingly, the director in this case did not actually speak Spanish himself, so I'm sure that caused some interesting production difficulties, but despite that, this movie turned out pretty great overall. The language barrier did not really seem to be much of a hindrance in terms of the filming itself. Um, I have heard a lot of people say that this is the superior one out of the two 1931 Universal Draculas, and that the only exception to that is Carlos Villarreal in the title role of Count Dracula. People have said that like the perfect, like the platonic ideal of Universal Dracula would be just the Spanish version of the movie, but replace Carlos Villarreal with Bela Lugosi's performance instead. And see that I get that. Like I do think that overall this version is the slightly superior version of the Universal 1931 Dracula. Um like the acting overall is a lot better. Um there's definitely like a more energy to the acting. Like people like they get into their roles a bit more, I think. They're more engaged with the script. But I don't think we should knock Carlos Villarreal too much. Um, like I think he is like a bit hammier in his performance.
I threw it on the ground. What you think I'm stupid?
And he doesn't seem to quite get the character the same way that Lugosi does. He's not terrible. He's not great, but he's not terrible. I don't think it's fine. It's a serviceable performance, I think. It's definitely not as good, but I think overall the acting, like everyone else, it's kind of is like the opposite of my opinion of the acting in the English version, where it's like everyone else is kind of like acting circles around him, whereas the opposite was true. Like, Lugosi and Dwight Fry were kind of acting circles around everyone else. But yeah, so it's definitely has like this sort of, creative vibe to it. Like they used more interesting shot compositions in general. I like that they kind of explained things a bit more um in this version. Like that I appreciate that they added back in the scene not of Lucy as a vampire being staked, because I don't think anyone would have really gone so far as to show that on screen at the time in the early 1930s. Like, it's not even, this is pre-code Hollywood still, but like, I think that would have been a little too shocking and graphic at the time then. But like, they do explain that it did happen. Like, there's a shot between like Jonathan, I believe, and Van Helsing outside the cemetery where they're like having this exchange like it was a good thing we like released her soul by staking that poor girl through the heart, whereas in the English version I forgot to mention that you're just kind of left hanging on the Lucy matter. Like she's brought up as the bloofer lady who's going around biting children, and then it's just like they never follow up on that. So for all we know, like she's still out there. Like there's still a vampire on the loose at the end of the movie, and it's never resolved. I'll worry about that another time. Not in the sequel, because the sequels never come back to that either. I kind of think that was a missed opportunity there. But they do follow up on that in this one, and I appreciate that. But also, this one does kind of drag along a bit. Like I mentioned, the creative film work, like the actual camera work, is way more interesting in most cases. It doesn't always quite work, but I think it usually does. And it's more creative, certainly, and more engaging to look at on screen often than in the quite flat camera work of the English version. But also, I think they were clearly very proud of their interesting shot compositions because those shots linger for so long. Like this one is like half an hour longer than the English version. Like, where is this like half an hour coming from? I guess it's just because they like drag out these like scenes and shots for so long sometimes, and it it didn't need to be this long. I think that is kind of like the one big downfall of this movie, because it is like some shots are a bit awkward, but in general it is quite beautiful, and I appreciate the creativity, but it's like they really were like a little too proud of what they did, because it's like they really just want to linger on it, and like did you see that? Did you see like what's happening on screen? Like yes. Yes, I got it. Like we can move on to the next scene now, or to just the next shot now. So I'm gonna give this one a C as well. Um, I do think it is like a C plus, maybe like almost a B compared to the English version, but at the end of the day, it does like wear on you after a while. It does get a little boring is harsh, but it does drag on just a little bit. Number 4, House of Frankenstein, 1944. Now, on the one hand, reviewing House of Frankenstein right after the original Universal Draculas, the English and Spanish ones, does sort of point out a flaw in my self-imposed rule against not including any sequels that don't have Count Dracula himself in them. Because while Dracula's daughter and Son of Dracula don't feature the Big D himself, both of them are certainly logically and thematically better follow-ups to the first movie than this one. On the other hand, the difficulty in understanding just what the fuck is going on in this movie has less to do with Dracula himself and more to do with the fact that it's technically a direct sequel to Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, which, as of time of recording, I have not yet seen. Yes, I know, as blasphemous as it may seem, I have not yet watched every single Universal horror movie, but I'm working on it, trust me. Trust me, I'm gonna watch them, okay? I'm gonna watch them. It's like my next project. It's not my next project, but like a future project. I'm gonna do like a ranking, I think, of all of the classic Universal monster movies. So yeah, part of my confusion is it's on me here, because number one, I didn't realize just how tenuous the connection was to the original Dracula, and number two, I had no clue why the Wolfman and Frankenstein's monster were frozen in an ice cave under a castle. But you're not here to hear me yap about all these other monsters, right? You're here for Dracula. That's why I'm here. I'm here for Dracula. Yeah, this one barely qualifies as a Dracula movie at all. Count Dracula's, he's in this for like a little bit, like 20 minutes. The first 20 minutes, he has nothing at all to do with the main plot. It turns back into a skeleton, and literally all the characters and any interaction with him besides Boris Karloff's mad scientist character disappear without a trace for the rest of the runtime. Certainly this is just Universal's first real monster mash film that featured more than just two of its monsters, and having all of their main monsters together for the first time was its big selling point. One can only assume that this little short film at the beginning featuring Dracula and a bunch of side characters we never really see again was tacked on to the front end of the movie at the last minute, because someone was like, oh my god, we forgot to have Dracula in it, and also to pad out the runtime to feature length, because this is another short film. It's like barely more than an hour, and so I think they felt that they needed that extra time with Dracula. And then just what the hell is it about? Well, it's mostly about brain swapping. Admittedly, I think a lot, perhaps most of the Universal Frankenstein films are about like brain swapping. But this one in particular, it just really confounded me. The way the film explains it's really confusing. It just leads me to believe that no one thought through the implications of a person's sense of self, like their personality, their memories, all that stuff that makes up who you are internally, centering around the brain, which feels like very obvious to me, like that all that stuff would center around your brain, not like your body. like on the one hand, like, you have characters like Larry Talbot, the Wolfman, who wants to have his brain implanted in a new body so they can stop transforming into the Wolfman, and Daniel, the hunchbacked assistant, who wants his brain transplanted into a non-disabled body. And yeah, putting aside the fact that brain transplants are total science fiction anyway, this does not make logical sense to me, as does Dr. Boris Karloff's revenge scheme to transplant the brain of one of his enemies into the body of Frankenstein's monster as a form of torture, I guess. Well, okay, I guess that one doesn't make as much sense because the monster is super strong and kind of immortal, so the logical through line to me would be that as soon as he wakes up after the transplant, he would instantly strangle Dr. Neiman, which is Boris Karloff. But whatever, you get the idea, the general idea of how these brain transplants are going to work, right? But then the other part of his revenge scheme involves him planting the Wolfman's brain into the body of his other enemy in order to force this guy to become a werewolf.
I'm going to give that brain of yours a new home in the skull of the Frankenstein monster. I'm going to give you the brain of the Wolfman, so that all your waking hours will be spent in untold agony.
But like, that would just make him like Larry Talbot though, wouldn't it? Because he's putting Larry's brain into him. So that's like, wouldn't that like become Larry's new body? Like that's kind of what Larry wanted in the first place, right? And like, isn't that exactly what you promised to do for Larry? Like in order to cure his lycanthropy, doctor? Like, what? Like, do you not mean that you're going to put your nemesis's brain into Larry's body in order to torture him by making him into the Wolfman? Like, no? Did Karloff just flub that line and no one caught it in editing or something? Or did no one give this script a second pass for basic logical consistency? Like, I get, this is fantasy, this is sci-fi. Like, they can't do brain transplants like this anyways. But like, I feel like there has to be some kind of logic, right? Like, I'm just not getting it. I just don't get it. Anyway, this movie is just plain sloppy. I can absolutely see why people were getting tired of monster movies by the time of the mid 1940s if this is what Universal was putting out. Like, this is very low effort, I gotta say. It also just feels like they didn't know how to end it because it just kind of stops very abruptly after the monster and the doctor get chased into quicksand. I think this one's gonna be the first F on the list. How exciting. Number 5, House of Dracula, 1945. So, given the title of this movie in particular, you'd think that it would be a pretty logical follow-up, I guess as logical as it can be, to House of Frankenstein, and that also it would be way more focused on Dracula, the character of Count Dracula, and sort of? Like, it's not really much. I don't know, like, the house. Where are these? Okay, I guess technically it's called House of Frankenstein because, like, the second half of the movie, like, the goal was to get to Frankenstein's castle, and then they got there and they did their, like, evil science experiments there. And then in this one, it's a little confusing. It's like, I think it's Dracula's house, like Dracula's castle, but someone else has moved into it, I think? It's a little confusing, like at the beginning of the movie. Also, you'll probably notice that Dracula in these movies is no longer being played by Bela Lugosi. Lugosi's personal history with Universal is very fraught. They kind of screwed him over, but also he didn't exactly help himself, honestly, I would say. But yes, he's not Dracula anymore. For complicated reasons. But so John Carradine is now playing Dracula. He also played Dracula in the last movie, and it's interestingly, it's one of the few ones in which he's actually portrayed as having a mustache, which he's described as having in the book. That being said, this Dracula, as played by John Carradine, bears no other like character resemblance to the character in the book. He's honestly doesn't even really seem much like the Dracula that we've previously established in Universal. He's nothing. He's basically like a completely different guy. He's like a reboot of Dracula as portrayed by Bela Lugosi. So I don't think anyone at Universal knew or really cared. They just wanted the name recognition of the character to make money. Um, yeah, because he's like definitely almost more, he's like a very much more morose kind of vampire who's not much like most other portrayals of Dracula. He's like, he wants, his goal is he wants to no longer be a vampire. He wants to be cured, which is very un-Dracula. Like, I don't think there's any other instance of Dracula where we see him like his goal being that he wants to be cured. It's like a very inconsistent goal in this, though. Like, he kind of seems to waver on it. I think, in a way, I don't know if this is an intentional metaphor, but it kind of seems to parallel addiction. And he's kind of like a seems to be like portrayed as like a lapsed addict because he goes, in for treatment. Like, he meets with this doctor who I guess, like, I'm not sure, like, this doctor, like, who happens to be the guy that he thinks can cure him anyways, is like living in his house, like in his castle. I don't know. I'm confused here. But anyway, but also I think it's the same castle as like the one in the last movie, which is Frankenstein's castle, because later on they find the monster and the doctor, like dead skeleton Boris Karloff from the last movie, like under in a cave. How did they end up in a cave, like under the castle? They were in quicksand in like the woods last time we saw them. What? I don't know.
The villagers drove them into the swamp. They went down in the quicksand. For all these years, the mud has brought them here.
Like, logic, canon, like everything's getting retconned here. This is going to be a reoccurring theme once we get to the Hammer films. Oh boy, is it ever. Um but yeah, so this is a convoluted plot, okay? Like, both of these movies, it's like they're not very long, but they try to like they have too many ideas. This is like rough draft, first draft ass writing. There was only one draft of this script. Like, I I don't have any proof of that. I just know. And I'm not going to say that's going to necessarily become a running theme. Okay, maybe it will be, like with the Hammer films, and then later on, once we get to the 2000s, it's just kind of like something that tends to happen with a few of these movies where it seems like they're just made very quickly with the ethos of making a quick buck, and they don't really end up making that many bucks. Um, so he's not very Dracula-ish Dracula, and also the notion of there being this very sci-fi-esque cure where like he and the human, in this case the doctor himself, can just kind of like swap blood. Like, they can do like a blood transfusion between the two of them, and then that'll cure him. But it's like it almost seems like Dracula has another secret plan because he kind of sabotages this transfusion himself. I don't know why. I don't know what goal he's working towards, except maybe he just wants to make the doctor a vampire. Because then it kind of like becomes almost like a Jekyll and Hyde as kind of plot briefly at the end, where the doctor is like becoming this like evil, like eyeliner wearing vampire version of himself, and then he'll snap out of it, and then he'll go back to that again. And I don't know, like, they're kind of not very clear on how this transformation is happening. And then, you know, Dracula dies again, and I just, yeah, I don't, one thing I will say that kind of does bother me about this movie and the last movie. And the other just movies in general from around this era is the casual ableism. Um, like there's another hunchback character in this. This time she's a woman, she's a nurse, and she's an unambiguously good character. I think they kind of realized that maybe they needed to subvert that trope of like the wicked, evil, vengeful bitter hunchback character just a bit because they kind of made her unambiguously a heroic and kind and sympathetic character throughout the whole movie, unlike with the character of Daniel in the last movie, or with Lugosi's Igor character in past movies as well. But they still, like, in the marketing for these movies, the Hunchback is considered one of the monsters. Like the monster lineup for these House of Frankenstein and Dracula movies on like the posters and stuff is Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mad Scientist, and the Hunchback. Like, this is kind of rude. She's not a monster. Like, come on, guys, come on. She's just a person. Um, yeah, anyways, this one's another F. It sucks. I wasted my time with this. Number 6, Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Feel free to argue with me in the comments below if you want, but yes, I do consider this to be a Universal Dracula sequel. If it's included in on the official Complete Legacy Collection DVD set, then that is good enough for me. And despite the fact that it's essentially a self parody by Universal of the poorly conceived monster mashes that I just talked about, it feels much more like a proper sequel to the 1931 film than either of those ones did. Also, it really should be called Abbott and Costello Meet Dracula, in my opinion, since he's really more of the main villain of the story. And also, they don't even meet Frankenstein in this movie, okay? They just meet the creature, the monster, okay? It's not Frankenstein himself. Now, I wouldn't say that having Bela Lugosi back in the role is the sole reason the Count feels more like his old self again, but it certainly does help. And he's generally really funny in this too. Like, it's a real shame that Lugosi did not have the opportunity to play more comedic roles in his career because he's a genuinely good comedy actor. He manages to completely sell it as the sinister vampire lord because, of course, he does, while also delivering some great background reaction shots in his first scene and some amazingly wry humor too.
What we need today is young bloods and brains. Miss Raymond, would you honor me with a dance?
No, no. I warn you, he is Count Dracula.
How interesting. Tell me more.
Now let me tell you while we dance.
Going back to town, I'm going to have... Excellent.
I'm not sure why he keeps covering his nose and mouth with his cape. It's a little weird. And sure, Dracula's motivation for wanting to revive Frankenstein's creature to make him his loyal slave isn't really explained at all, but it doesn't really need to be because it's all in service of bringing Abbott and Costello into the plot. Lots of classic Universal villains before this had paper thin motivations, and audiences were expected to take them seriously. So it makes sense to me that in a spoof of the horror genre they created, it would simply be taken as a given and also as a joke that, of course, Dracula wants to revive the monster, and of course, he ends up fighting the Wolfman over it. Considering the often thankless roles given to women in a lot of classic horror films, it was surprisingly refreshing that the evil scientist character in this got to be a woman, and no one seemed to think anything of this lady being a brain surgeon, so that's kind of neat for a movie of the 1940s. Overall, I think this movie holds up incredibly well, and I think this kind of screwball slapstick humor has become a bit of a lost art in a lot of modern comedies. I guess if you hate fun, you could argue that it's lowbrow and plays to the lowest common denominator, but it got a laugh out of me. It's almost entirely inoffensive, apart from a couple culturally insensitive costumes during the party scene. which I guess is kind of to be expected. But it's not reliant on like puerile sex jokes or bodily excretions for comedy, and it's generally quite timeless for a film that's over 70 years old. Put this one on TV on Halloween as a double bill with Young Frankenstein, and you've got yourself some prime post trick or treat viewing, I think. And also, I think this one might be our first S tier of the day. Yeah! Number 7, Dracula Istanbul'da, aka Dracula in Istanbul, 1953. Apologies for my terrible Turkish pronunciation there. Now, this one is interesting for a couple reasons. For starters, it is technically the second, as far as I know, as far as I could find, the second after Nosferatu foreign made Dracula film on this list, and is also the second one to involve plagiarism in some way, so copyright infringement. Although not really the movie itself, this time, but rather what it was based on, because it was based on not technically Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula, but an unofficial bootleg translation with great liberties taken, um, called Dracula in Istanbul, which for many years people did not know was not an original work. They did not know that it was based off of the novel by Bram Stoker. They thought it was unique to its author slash translator. So that is what this movie is based on. Is based on that book. Like Nosferatu, it transplants the action from England to the country in which it was made, Turkey, and unlike Nosferatu, but like the 1931 film, it updates the setting to the year, the rather contemporary times that it takes place in, that was filmed in. So early 1950s Istanbul, which is interesting because that's a cultural setting that I don't really have much familiarity with. So it was kind of interesting to see, like how these characters move throughout the world in ways that are different than how they operated in the book and in other adaptations. I think probably one of the most interesting changes is in the character of Mina, who is renamed to Uzim in this. She gets like to have a little bit more agency in this than Mina or any of the other female characters do in a lot of these adaptations, unfortunately. You'll notice that I did kind of forget to talk about most of the female characters in the Universal films, and that's because there's not much to talk about with them. The female characters don't really have any character, they just kind of exist to be distressed damsels and cry and die and be rescued and be motivation for the male characters, and that's about it. Which is not really the case in the book. Maybe kind of with Lucy, but with Mina, like Mina, God, Mina's like one of my favorite fictional characters. She has flaws. She has flaws to be sure, but otherwise, like, but she's also perfect. Go on about Mina for hours, and I will in another video that I have coming up about a specific Dracula adaptation that I have some serious beef with. But just for now, I'll say that you would not really know just like how much Mina Murray Harker contributes to the plot and how much agency that she has as a person, just simply based on like any adaptation of Dracula that you might watch. And it's kind of sad that like usually the few times where her character or the character most similar to her actually gets to have like free agency and make choices and move the plot along in any way is in the Nosferatu versions where she basically always dies. Um, and in this one, like she's still, mostly kind of a bit of a damsel in distress, but she does get to have more agency. She's presented as like a very modern woman. Like it is still like the 1950s, so there is like kind of like an offhanded reference that like once she gets settled more into her marriage, that eventually she's going to quit her job in order to become a homemaker, but they don't have really dig into that much. They kind of gloss over it a bit, but she does have a job. We see her at her job. She has this, kind of successful career as a nightclub dancer, like a sexy nightclub dancer, which I think is a very interesting choice. Like it seems like one that's like very specific to the culture, and I think it's interesting that it's not something that she is judged for. She's not shown in like an extremely like provocative erotic context, but she is like still kind of allowed to exhibit her sexuality a little bit. She's performing. It's this kind of profession that I think that if she was maybe in a Hammer horror film, this would signal that she's like the bad girl who gets killed and turned into a like nasty vampire in the like around the middle of the film. She's not the good girl who gets to live. But that's not the case in this one. She is the good final girl character, and she gets to have this kind of job, and like no one makes a big deal about it, and I think that's kind of cool. um and she does have like a lot more personality to her certainly than the other female characters did, that who are just like complete wet blankets. Like they're just very wet, like Mina and Lucy in the Universal 1931 version, unfortunately. But yeah, she gets to have, you know, bit of sass to her. She's got some personality, and I like that. And the same with like the Lucy character too, although, she doesn't really stick around for very long. Um, and yeah, I think another interesting thing about this movie too, it's, as far as I know, the first version in any language to explicitly conflate the character of Count Dracula with the historical person of Vlad the Impaler, aka Vlad Dracula. This is another thing that I'm going to bring up in my future um, video on Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, the more in-depth review of that movie in particular that I'm going to do. But I'm gonna just bring it up here really quick, is just to say, just to get off my chest that no, Bram Stoker did not base Count Dracula off of Vlad Dracula, at least not to the extent or in the way that everyone likes to claim these days. He basically like just took the name and like a couple minor details from his life, just vague stuff. He didn't intend them to be the same person. That being said, I'm not just bringing this up now to say that I have a problem with that in this movie. I think it's perfectly, in theory, I think it's perfectly fine to, have Vlad Dracula be a vampire or be the same guy as Count Dracula in your movie. It's just, I'm clenching my teeth over it because it's just become such a prevalent trope and almost the expected thing to do in movies and TV shows and books that are about Dracula these days. That people just kind of like take it for granted that they're the same guy, and that's it's just kind of a very tired trope at this point. But at this point, it's not really a trope at all. So it's fine. I just think it's kind of become a very lazy way to give Dracula a backstory these days. But that's not what this movie is doing, especially because within the cultural context of Turkey specifically, that is the Dracula that people would have been most familiar with. So their context for Dracula was Vlad the Impaler, who had a very long history and beef with the Ottoman Empire. Like, he would have been terrifying as a historical figure to Turkish people. And me making him a vampire just kind of makes sense in that way, and having him be the villain makes sense in that way. Being said, they don't really do much with that in this movie. I think they just mention it kind of once offhandedly, and you would like otherwise would not know that he is Vlad the Impaler. He doesn't look anything like him. Like they make him bald. He's got like kind of a real Yul Brynner sort of bald look to him. It's also interesting because this is the first Dracula, and I think maybe one of the earliest on-screen vampires to have fangs. Um, they look like a little more like walrus tusks in this to me. They're like kind of kind of splayed out and don't really look like they're very efficient for blood drinking and biting, but hey, what do I know? Um, and it's like it's a fairly standard sort of telling of Dracula for the most part, apart from the aspects that I mentioned. It doesn't really get too creative otherwise. With the storytelling. The one really kind of weird thing about it is that Dracula kind of briefly does have this like servant character, which is almost a bit like I don't know if he's meant to be like Renfield or something. He lives in the castle, which I think kind of ruins the vibe of Dracula kind of being alone and being forced to be his own servant waiting on Jonathan. Um, it's like this random, just weirdo guy just kind of like pops up, and then he just gets killed by Dracula when the Jonathan character is trying to escape or something, and then it's just like just disappears, and it's like it was just felt very random, and it kind of ruined the tension and the horror of that part of the story because I think it's much more impactful when Jonathan or the Jonathan character in this is just very isolated and alone in the spooky castle with the vampires, and I'm not quite sure what the thinking was behind that. Also, the ending just kind of really falls flat. Like it almost kind of seems like they were going for a comedy ending. It feels like a 1950s sitcom. I was expecting there to be like an I Love Lucy kind of laugh track at the end, but it wasn't funny. It was like, I don't know, if am I supposed to be laughing? What's going on here? Like everyone just like he the Jonathan guy, I keep forgetting his name, but the Jonathan character, he like tracks Dracula down to a cemetery and he's like in a grave there and he like steals some like grave digging tools and the caretaker's just like, "Oh, whatever." And he just like stabs this guy who's like laying in the grave, a Dracula, and it's like that's a little weird. Like, we don't know what happens to his body, so I assume the body is still there in the grave, and someone's gonna have questions about that. But then he goes home to where, like, his wife and, like, the Van Helsing guy and everyone else is just sort of, like, hanging out and is like, well, I killed Dracula. And then everyone just goes home. And then there's just, like, this very awkwardly long scene where he and Guzim are just, like, walking around taking all the garlic off of the windows, and then they're like, "Ha ha ha, I don't think we're gonna be cooking with garlic for a while." Yeah, so I think I would say check this one out, but I wouldn't go into it with extremely high expectations. I'm gonna give this one a C simply because it's kind of interesting, like culturally and historically, but also other than that, just kind of lackluster. But it's not bad. It's like an improvement over some of the past couple movies I've watched.